7 miles of water sit on top of nothing but silence and cold. At that depth, pressure builds high enough to crush a steel drum flatter than a coin in less than a second. For most of human history, nobody had any real way to measure it, let alone reach it. Then, using nothing but a length of rope and a lead weight, a small ship crew stumbled onto something that would take over a century to even begin to understand. What they found at the bottom still doesn't fully add up. In 1875, a British research ship called HMS Challenger was sailing through the western Pacific Ocean, taking measurements of the seafloor as it went. The crew lowered a weighted rope over the side near the Mariana Islands, waiting for it to hit bottom the way it had at every other stop on the voyage. This time, the rope kept unspooling. Foot after foot, it kept dropping, far past what anyone expected. By the time it finally went slack, the crew had measured a depth of more than 4,000 fathoms, close to 8,000 meters straight down. Nobody on board had the tools to explain what they had just found. They had accidentally discovered the deepest known point in any ocean on Earth, using a rope decades before anyone had a way to actually see it. That single measurement created a location on a map with no real information behind it. For the next 80 years, that spot stayed almost completely untouched. No pictures, no samples, nothing but a number written in a logbook. Ships passed over it. Storms rolled above it. But the actual floor of what came to be called the Challenger Deep remained a blank space, more unknown to humans than most of the surface of the moon would eventually become. The trench itself runs for about 2,500 miles along the edge of the Pacific Plate, and its lowest point drops close to 10,935 meters below the surface, deep enough to fully submerge Mount Everest with room to spare above the peak. Sunlight stops reaching the ocean at around 1,000 meters. Everything below that line exists in total permanent darkness, all day, every day, with no exceptions. Near the bottom, the pressure is more than 1,000 times what a person feels standing on land, roughly the same as balancing the weight of several dozen elephants on a single fingertip. The water hovers just above freezing, cold enough to make metal brittle over time. Nothing about that environment is designed to welcome visitors, and for decades after the original 1875 measurement, that fact alone was enough to keep almost everyone away. The first real attempt to change that came on January 23rd, 1960. A Swiss engineer and a United States Navy officer climbed into a thick steel diving sphere called a bathyscaphe and began sinking toward the Challenger Deep. The descent took nearly 5 hours. Partway down, at a depth of several thousand meters, a loud bang rattled the entire vehicle. Both men checked every gauge inside the tiny cabin. Nothing looked broken, so they kept going anyway, since turning back that deep into the descent was barely an option. They reached the bottom and stayed for only about 20 minutes before starting the long trip back up. In that short window, both men reported seeing a flat, pale creature resting on the seafloor beneath them, something that looked like a fish in a place where almost nothing was expected to survive. Scientists have argued about that sighting for decades, since the pressure down there could flatten most living tissue instantly. The loud bang, it later turned out, came from a cracked outer window, damage serious enough that it could have ended in total failure within seconds. For more than 50 years afterward, nobody else attempted to repeat that dive. The gap between how many people had reached space and how many had reached the ocean floor kept growing wider every year that passed. It wasn't until the 2010s that a new wave of ocean scientists decided the silence had gone on long enough. A research program known as HADES, short for Hadal Ecosystem Studies, was built specifically to send equipment into trenches like this one without risking a single human life. Instead of a manned submarine, the team used unmanned landers, simple frames packed with cameras, bait, and pressure-proof housing, built to survive the crushing weight below and drop straight to the bottom on their own. Losing a lander was always a real possibility. Getting one back with working footage was never guaranteed. On one of the early missions, a lander was released from the surface and allowed to sink for hours with no live signal, no way to check on it, and no way to bring it back early if something went wrong. When the ship's crew finally hauled the frame back onto the deck and pulled the footage, what came back on the memory card left the team stunned. Scattered across the bait plate in the deepest part of the trench ever filmed at that point were pale, blob-like shapes nobody on the team could immediately identify. They weren't fish. They barely looked like animals at all. If a story like this is the kind of thing that keeps you curious about what else is still unexplained on this planet, this channel covers a new one every week, and sticking around means you won't miss the next one. The shapes turned out to belong to something called a xenophophore, a single giant cell, not a colony of cells, not a small animal, just one cell, grown large enough to be seen without a microscope. Some measure several inches across, making them among the largest single cells known to exist anywhere on Earth. They have no nervous system, no muscles, and no brain of any kind, yet they build intricate shell-like structures around themselves, out of sediment and mineral grains from the seafloor. Researchers studying them found something even stranger. Xenophyophories appear to tolerate extremely high concentrations of heavy metals, including lead, uranium, and mercury, at levels that would be lethal to almost any other living thing. Nobody has fully explained how a single cell survives that kind of chemical exposure while also enduring crushing pressure and near freezing temperatures, with no light at all. Some scientists believe these organisms may be acting almost like living filters, quietly processing toxic material that settles onto the trench floor from thousands of feet above. If that theory holds up, an entire ecosystem 7 miles down might be shaping ocean chemistry in ways nobody accounted for until landers started sending pictures back. That single discovery proved something researchers had doubted for years. Life didn't just survive in the deepest, darkest, most crushing place on the planet. It had been quietly building strange, complex structures down there the entire time, completely unnoticed. And the deeper scientists looked afterward, the more that pattern kept repeating. That question connects to something far bigger than one strange organism. The Mariana Trench isn't just a deep hole in the ocean floor. It marks the boundary where the Pacific tectonic plate is slowly forced underneath the smaller Mariana plate, sinking back into the Earth's mantle in a process called subduction. This exact stretch of seafloor sits along the Ring of Fire, the same chain of fault, lines responsible for the majority of the planet's largest earthquakes and most active volcanoes. Seismologists monitoring the region have recorded deep, low-frequency tremors, originating from far below the trench floor, movement that happens too far down and under too much pressure for any human equipment to observe directly. That means the deepest, most crushing place on the entire planet is also one of its most geologically active, quietly grinding and shifting in a way that occasionally sends shockwaves through the wider Pacific basin. A location once thought of as empty and still turns out to be one of the more physically active places on Earth, just hidden under miles of water and darkness. Machines sent to study that activity have not always survived the trip either. Multiple unmanned vehicles built specifically to withstand Hadal pressure have been lost on missions to trenches like this one over the years, their signals cutting out without warning, their wreckage sometimes never recovered at all. One early robotic vehicle completed more than 200 successful dives before its support cable snapped during a storm on the surface, sending it to the bottom for good with no way to bring it back. Years later, a different vehicle built by a major ocean research institute lost contact entirely while exploring a separate trench, and the only trace the crew ever found was a small amount of floating debris, evidence that part of the vehicle had imploded under pressure strong enough to destroy hardened steel in a fraction of a second. Engineers describe designing hardware for this depth as building something meant to fail exactly once, since a single crack in the wrong housing means instant destruction with no chance to surface and repair it. Even with modern materials, reaching the bottom and returning safely is still treated as a genuine risk every single time a mission is planned. The creatures living in that same crushing environment are just as strange as the machines built to study them. Deep-sea trenches around the world are home to fish with soft, almost gelatinous bodies built to handle pressure instead of resisting it with hard bone or scales. Some have nearly transparent skin, so their organs are visible from the outside, and bodies that only hold their shape properly under the exact weight of water they evolved to live in. Scavengers called amphipods, small shrimp-like creatures, swarm anything that falls from above and strip it clean within hours. Some species growing far larger than their shallow water relatives, thanks to a phenomenon researchers still don't fully understand. Recent studies testing amphipods pulled from several different deep-sea trenches found that nearly every single sample already contained tiny fragments of plastic in its digestive system, meaning even the most remote scavengers on the entire planet are already eating human trash before scientists have finished cataloging what they are. That fact connects to something explorers have found sitting directly on the trench floor itself. During a dive that reached the very bottom of the Challenger Deep, one modern explorer spotted new species, colorful rock formations, and strange, translucent sea creatures resting on the seafloor. He also spotted something else down there, a plastic bag, along with wrappers that clearly hadn't come from any animal. It wasn't the first time plastic had been documented at the deepest known point in any ocean. Human garbage had reached the most remote, hardest to access location on the entire planet before most people had even learned that an ecosystem existed down there at all. That fact alone is unsettling, since it means the most isolated place on Earth is already not untouched by what happens on the surface, thousands of meters above it. Reaching that same depth again in modern times has not gotten dramatically easier, even with better technology. In 2012, a filmmaker piloted a specially built vertical submersible to the bottom completely alone, folded into a steel capsule barely large enough to hold him, in a dive that had not been repeated by anyone in more than 50 years. He described the landscape as flat, mostly featureless, and about as hostile to life as anywhere he could imagine on the planet, at least on first glance. On the way back up, one of the vehicle's hydraulic arms failed, cutting his time on the bottom shorter than planned. His trip proved a single person could reach the deepest point on Earth and return safely, but it also confirmed just how alone a person truly is down there with no backup vehicle nearby, and no way to reach help if anything went wrong during those final crushing meters of the descent. Fewer people alive today have stood on the floor of the Challenger Deep than have walked on the surface of the moon. For most of the last century, that trivia actually ran the opposite way, since more people had reached the moon than had ever reached the deepest point of the ocean, and it only started to shift in the last several years as more expeditions became possible. Reaching orbit and reaching the trench floor both require extreme engineering, but in opposite directions. Astronauts fight against a total lack of pressure, while trench explorers fight against too much of it, strong enough to implode hardened steel and glass built, specifically to survive the trip. Both environments are lethal within seconds without the right equipment, and both remain almost entirely unexplored compared to the size of what is actually out there waiting. The story of the Mariana Trench keeps circling back to the same pattern. A location gets measured almost by accident, gets left alone for decades out of necessity, and then gets revisited only when new technology finally makes it possible. Each time that happens, something turns up that doesn't fit cleanly into what scientists expected, whether it's a single cell large enough to see with the naked eye, an active fault line still reshaping the seafloor from below, or human trash sitting in a place nobody was supposed to reach for another century. Nobody currently studying the trench claims to have a complete picture of what's actually down there, and every new mission tends to raise more questions than it answers. If the bottom of the ocean can still surprise researchers using tools built in the last decade, it raises an uncomfortable question about how much of it remains completely unknown, and that mystery alone is worth following. The moment new footage from down there finally surfaces, so subscribing now means catching that update the instant it happens.